Okay, so imagine this. You're owed a whole lot of money,
Oh, yeah?
and you're waiting for over a decade to get paid.
Oh.
And instead of cash, you're promised shares in a golf course.
Okay.
But get this, the golf course doesn't even exist.
Whoa. What?
That's the wild story we're diving into today.
Sounds juicy.
It's a wild case from the Philippines.
Interesting.
Hirakawa versus Lopzcom Realty Corporation.
Okay.
Decided on December 5, 2019. Officially, GR No 2-2013-14.
Yeah.
And trust me, this one is full of twists and turns.
Yeah, I bet the law can be pretty wild sometimes, right?
It really can. Especially when it comes to contracts and what's fair.
Yeah, I mean, we always hear about, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Exactly. This case is a perfect example of that.
Yay.
So someone's trying to enforce a contract that they didn't actually sign.
Oh, that's tricky.
It is. Let's break it down for our listener. Who are the players and what went down?
All right, so we've got a Japanese national, Naoaki Hirakawa.
Okay.
He ends up in this legal battle with a Philippine realty corporation, Lopzcom, and their chairman, this lawyer named Gari Tiongco.
Got it.
Now, at the center of it all is this land deal that went very wrong. Back in 1995, Lopzcom bought a subdivision project in Cebu City from a man named Takezo Sakai. Big price tag, P100 million.
Wow.
But instead of cash, Lopzcom paid with postdated checks.
Postdated checks. Yeah, those could be risky.
They definitely are. So now you're probably wondering, where does Hirakawa fit into all of this?
Right. He wasn't part of that initial sale, was he?
You're right, he wasn't. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
So Sakai, the original seller, assigned 4 of those postdated checks, worth P40 million to Hirakawa.
Yeah.
He basically transferred his right to collect that money.
So kind of like handing over an IOU.
Exactly.
I see.
The question then becomes, does this give Hirakawa the legal right to sue when those checks inevitably bounce?
Right.
And you guessed it, those checks did bounce.
Well, so what happened then?
Lopzcom, they even acknowledged the assignment. They issued new checks with Hirakawa's name on them, but Tiongco's account was closed.
Oh, wow. So they basically just ignored the whole thing.
Yeah, it's pretty bold.
So did Hirakawa sue them right away?
He actually showed a lot of patience.
Really?
Which honestly makes this case even more interesting.
I see.
He waited for years accepting interest payments, and even this proposal from Tiongco for shares in a golf course project to try and settle the debt.
A golf course?
Yeah.
That's a new one. I haven't heard that one before.
Right. It's pretty creative.
Yeah.
Only problem was this golf course project never actually happened.
A phantom golf course.
Exactly.
Wow.
After years of waiting and all these empty promises, Hirakawa finally decided enough is enough.
Yeah.
He took Lopzcom and Tiongco to court in 2010 for breach of contract.
Okay, so at that point, it sounds like he had a pretty strong case.
Right.
You know, he has those assigned checks.
Yeah.
A history of broken promises.
Yep.
And this whole golf course fiasco. So what happened when it went to court?
Well, the initial ruling from the trial court actually went in Hirakawa's favor.
Oh?
They allowed the case to move forward. They recognized his right to sue.
Good for him.
But then hold on to your hats because the Court of Appeals stepped in and completely flipped the script.
Wait a minute. So the trial court said he could sue, and then the Court of Appeals said he couldn't?
Yeah.
What was their reasoning?
The Court of Appeals focused on the fact that Hirakawa wasn't a party to that original sale agreement.
Okay.
They cited this legal principle, relativity of contracts.
Relativity of contracts.
Which basically means a contract only binds the original parties who signed it.
So even though Hirakawa had those assigned checks, the Court of Appeals basically said, tough luck, you weren't part of the original deal.
Yeah, pretty much.
That doesn't seem very fair.
Right, and that's where you get that tension between the strict application of the law and the pursuit of justice.
Yeah.
The Court of Appeals stuck to this rigid interpretation of the contract.
Right.
Which, on the surface, seems to make sense.
Yeah.
But it left Hirakawa in a really tough spot.
So what did he do next? Did he just give up?
No, he didn't.
What did he do?
He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. This is getting serious.
It is.
So what were the big legal questions that the Supreme Court had to grapple with?
They had a lot to unpack.
I bet.
They had to consider that concept of relativity of contracts,
Right.
which the Court of Appeals had focused on, but also weigh it against this concept of substance over form,
Okay.
which looks beyond just the literal wording of a contract and considers the real intention behind it.
I see.
They also had to consider the legal implications of that check assignment
Right.
and all the agreements between Hirakawa and Lopzcom that happened afterward.
So did the check assignment give Hirakawa enough legal standing to sue?
Exactly.
And did the spirit of the agreement, the intent behind it, really matter more than the strict wording of that original contract?
That's the big question.
Wow, this is getting complex.
It is, and this is where the Supreme Court's decision gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did they decide? Did they side with Hirakawa or with Lopzcom?
So after years of waiting multiple court battles, what did the Supreme Court have to say about all of this?
Well, in a decision that really gets to the core of contract law, they ruled in favor of Hirakawa.
Really? So if the Court of Appeals said he couldn't sue because he wasn't part of that original contract, how did the Supreme Court justify their decision?
Right, that's where their interpretation gets really interesting.
Okay.
They agreed with the Court of Appeals that Hirakawa couldn't technically sue for breach of that original sale contract. However, they took a different approach.
Interesting.
They focused on the assigned checks and all the agreements that came later,
Okay.
including that whole phantom golf course proposal.
Right. So they were looking at the bigger picture, the whole relationship between Hirakawa and Lopzcom, not just that initial contract.
Exactly. They said Hirakawa's case wasn't just about that original sale.
It was about him trying to recover a debt based on those checks and the promises made after that initial transaction.
So they basically shifted the focus of the case.
Yeah, they even called it a simple collection suit.
Okay, so the Supreme Court was basically saying, look, the original contract isn't the only thing that matters here. We have to look at all the interactions between these parties. I'm guessing this is where that substance over form principle comes in.
You got it. The Supreme Court emphasized that the intent was for Hirakawa to be paid.
Right.
Regardless of whether his name was on that original sale document.
Okay.
And they found that Lopzcom's actions, like issuing those new checks with Hirakawa's name on them, further solidified his right to collect that debt.
This is reminding me of that saying, actions speak louder than words. Even though the original contract didn't include him, Lopzcom's actions clearly showed they acknowledged that debt to Hirakawa.
Exactly. And the court really hammered home the point that Hirakawa had been waiting for over a decade for a resolution.
Right.
And they weren't going to let a strict legal technicality lead to what they called a clearly unjust outcome.
Wow, so what happened to Lopzcom? Do they finally have to pay up?
Well, the Supreme Court sent the case back to the lower court to figure out exactly how much was owed to Hirakawa.
Okay.
It's fascinating how the Supreme Court can step in and really reframe a legal issue like this.
Yeah.
Highlighting how important it is to consider the context and fairness.
Yeah, it feels like a reminder that the law isn't always black and white.
Right.
Sometimes it takes creativity and a willingness to look beyond just the surface to make sure that justice is served.
Definitely.
But let's back up for a second.
Okay.
I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to really understand some of these specific legal concepts that came into play here.
Sure.
You mentioned assignment earlier. Can you explain what that means in this context?
Of course. So assignment in legal terms basically means transferring rights and obligations from one party to another.
Okay.
In this case, Sakai assigned his right to collect on those 4 checks to Hirakawa. This created a new legal relationship.
Right.
Even though Hirakawa wasn't part of that original sale.
So it's like Sakai handed over his right to that money to Hirakawa. And since Lopzcom acknowledged this and issued those new checks in Hirakawa's name, that strengthened his legal position.
Exactly. It showed their intent to honor that assignment. Now, there's another legal concept that we see come up in this case.
Okay.
Novation. Remember how Tiongco tried to settle the debt with shares in that non-existent golf course?
Oh, right, that phantom golf course.
Right?
So how does novation relate to that attempt to settle the debt?
So novation is basically when you replace an old contract with a brand new one. In this case, Tiongco was proposing to swap that P40 million cash payment for shares in that golf course.
Yeah.
If Hirakawa had accepted and
Right.
the golf course was real, that would have been a valid novation ending the original obligation.
So it's like hitting the reset button on the deal, but both sides have to agree?
Exactly. But in this case, even though Hirakawa initially agreed, the novation wasn't completed because the golf course was a bust.
Oh, right.
This meant the original obligation to pay the P40 million was still in effect.
Okay. So Tiongco's attempt to kind of change the deal didn't get him off the hook for that initial debt. This case is like a law school exam come to life.
It kind of is.
So we've got relativity of contracts, substance, over form, assignment, and novation.
Are there any other legal nuggets we need to know to fully grasp all the complexities of this case?
There's one more concept that's really important here. Remember how the Court of Appeals dismissed Hirakawa's case?
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court ultimately reversed that decision?
Right.
This brings up the concept of jurisdiction,
Okay.
the authority of a court to hear and decide a case.
Ah, jurisdiction. That makes sense. So the Supreme Court was essentially saying the Court of Appeals made a mistake, and they had the power to correct that mistake. Can you elaborate a bit more on how jurisdiction works in the Philippines?
Absolutely. So the Philippine legal system has this hierarchy of courts.
Okay.
You have trial courts, which
Right.
handle cases initially. Got it.
Then there's the Court of Appeals,
Yeah,
which reviews decisions made by trial courts.
I see.
And at the very top, you have the Supreme Court,
Right.
which has the final say.
Makes sense.
Each court has its own specific jurisdiction, meaning it can only hear certain types of cases.
So in this case, the Supreme Court had the jurisdiction to review the Court of Appeals decision because it was a matter of national significance, a case that could potentially impact how contract law is interpreted in the Philippines.
That's a great point. The Supreme Court often takes on cases that involve important legal principles or have wider implications for society.
Okay.
In this case, their decision clarified how those concepts of relativity of contracts and substance over form should be applied,
Yeah.
sending a clear message to lower courts and the legal community.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
It sounds like the Supreme Court isn't just deciding individual cases. They're also shaping the legal landscape of the Philippines.
Exactly. Their decisions set precedents that influence how future cases are decided. And that's why it's so important to understand the reasoning behind their rulings,
Right.
the legal principles that they emphasize, and the broader context that they're operating in.
So for our listener, if they're ever faced with a tricky legal situation involving a contract, it might be helpful to look back at this case and see how the Supreme Court approached similar issues.
Absolutely. It's a great example of how these legal principles can be applied in real-world scenarios. And it also highlights the importance of seeking expert legal advice if you're ever unsure about your rights or obligations under a contract.
This deep dive is really giving us a lot to think about.
It is.
Not just the specifics of this case,
Yeah.
but also the bigger picture of how the Philippine legal system works
Right.
and how these complex legal concepts play out in real life.
Definitely.
It's a reminder that the law is this living, breathing entity,
Yeah.
constantly evolving and adapting to new situations.
Hmm.
And cases like this one push the boundaries of legal interpretation and force us to confront the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead.
I agree.
It's like a never-ending puzzle, with each case adding a new piece to the bigger picture. But this particular case, with its international intrigue and that phantom golf course, is definitely one of the most unique and captivating pieces we've encountered. But before we wrap up, I want to turn the tables a bit and ask you, as our resident expert, what stands out to you about this case?
That's a great question. I think what I find most remarkable about this case is the Supreme Court's willingness to look beyond just the strict letter of the law
Right.
and to consider the broader context, the history of the interactions between the parties, and the potential for an unjust outcome.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the law at its core is about fairness and justice.
Right.
And sometimes that requires more nuanced approach than simply applying rigid rules.
That's a really powerful insight. It shows that even in a system as complex as the law, there's room for empathy and a recognition of the human impact of these legal decisions. And I think that's what makes this case so compelling. It's not just this dry legal analysis, it's a story about persistence, about holding someone accountable for broken promises, and about the court's role in ensuring fairness. It's like they say, the wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. This case really took us on a journey through the Philippine legal system.
It did. And it's important to remember that even though we've been focusing on all these legal details, there's a human story at the heart of this.
That's a really good point. Imagine being Naoaki Hirakawa, a Japanese national, thousands of miles from home, navigating this complex legal battle for over a decade.
Right. It couldn't have been easy for him to keep pursuing this case for so long, especially in a foreign country.
Exactly. It really speaks volumes about his determination and his belief in the legal process. And to the court's credit, they did acknowledge that. Remember how they specifically mentioned the 14 years that he had been waiting and called a dismissal at that point unjust?
Yeah.
That felt significant.
It was. The court wasn't just looking at, cold, hard facts. They were also considering the human impact of their decision.
This brings up a question for me. What does this case tell us about the Philippine legal system as a whole? Does it inspire confidence, or does it raise concerns about potential delays and complexities?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. On the one hand, the fact that Hirakawa, a foreign national, was able to ultimately prevail demonstrates that the Philippine legal system can deliver justice even in these really intricate cases involving contract law and international transactions.
That's encouraging.
It is. It shows that the courts are willing to go beyond the surface to look at the intent behind these agreements and to really prioritize fairness.
Right. But as you pointed out, it took years for Hirakawa to achieve this victory.
Right.
And that raises concerns about efficiency and accessibility.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder if there are ways to maybe streamline the legal process,
Yeah.
especially for individuals who are seeking to recover debts. Are there mechanisms that could maybe expedite these types of cases and make the system a little less daunting, particularly for those who are navigating it from a foreign country?
Right.
These are really important questions to consider.
It sounds like this case, while a win for Hirakawa, also kind of opens up this broader conversation about how to improve the legal system as a whole.
It does. It reminds us that the law is constantly evolving and adapting to the complexities of modern society. And cases like this one, with all of its twists and turns, they really push the boundaries of legal interpretation and force us to confront the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hirakawa versus Lopzcom Realty Corporation, what's the key takeaway for our listener? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
I think this case really highlights the importance of truly understanding your rights and obligations when you're entering into any agreement, even something that seems pretty straightforward at the beginning.
Right, because sometimes even a simple contract can lead to these unexpected complications.
Exactly. It also emphasizes the need to be aware of these legal concepts like assignment and novation, which can significantly impact your rights and your responsibilities.
And it really underscores the fact that while justice can prevail, the path to actually achieving it can be long and winding.
Definitely. It's a reminder that persistence is key, especially when you're navigating these legal complexities.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. It's amazing how a single case can reveal so much about the law of human behavior and this pursuit of justice. Big thanks to our expert for guiding us through this intricate legal maze.
My pleasure. I always enjoy unpacking these complex cases and shedding light on the legal principles that really shape our world.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive insightful. If you did, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating explorations of law business and everything in between.
We love diving deep into these topics and bringing you the insights that you won't find anywhere else.
Until next time.